I need to tell you about Carla. Carla was a client that I worked with in the leakless living program, who, when she came to me, she had some leaking and some other bladder symptoms. So she always felt like she needed to pee. She was peeing every 30 minutes or so, which was really starting to affect her life. What she found was that anytime she had errands to do, she would actually plan her route depending on which store would have a bathroom that she was happy to use, which meant that if she had to do an extra stop, she literally had to do some like errands math to figure out which one would come first so that she would have access to a bathroom. She was always mapping out where the closest toilet was. And because of this, she was really pulling back from trying new things, going to new locations, traveling, because she was really fearful of whether she was ever going to find a bathroom or what would happen. Would it be super uncomfortable? Would it cause a lot of stress and anxiety? And would she have those embarrassing leaks? This was really holding her back. But the leaking wouldn't just happen when she was out and about, it would happen when she was at home as well. And so she was at her wit's end, and that's when we started to work together. Once we started to work together, we started to figure out what were the true root causes of her leaking. And pretty quickly, we found out that it had nothing to do with her pelvic floor muscles, nothing to do about how well she could Kegel, or whether she could get a perfect 5 out of 5 score on a pelvic floor physical therapist test of her pelvic floor muscles. This had nothing to do with it. What Carla's challenge was about bladder sensitivity, and that bladder sensitivity was making her bladder overactive and making the leaking happen and some of her other bladder symptoms. So if I take just a 30-second, maybe a little bit longer moment to explain why leaking can sometimes happen, is that it happens from a pressure game. If the pressure inside of the bladder is higher than the pressure closing the bladder, you're going to have leaking. So for example, if I filled up a water balloon, didn't really tie a knot on the end, and then handed it to my kiddo to play with, as soon as we let go, the water's going to come rushing out. It's a similar thing with the bladder. If you have more pressure in and around the bladder than you do have closing the bladder, then that urine is going to escape easily. Closing that bladder wasn't Carla's major challenge. Her pelvic floor muscles were working just fine. But what was happening is that there were multiple things in her life and in her body that were creating more pressure in and around the bladder. The biggest one for her was how her body was handling things like stress, anxiety, and potentially some trauma in her life. Now, what can happen is that those things, stress, anxiety, and trauma, can really create overactivity in both the bladder and in the pelvic floor. So the pelvic floor can actually become overactive, more rigid than we want to, and it doesn't make for a very efficient closure of that exit of the bladder. But if we go back to the other end, the bladder, it can create sensitivity. So even if the bladder isn't very full, it starts to maybe think that it's full enough and start to contract its strong muscular walls, even if we're not on a toilet, which can create urgency or a discomfort to get to the toilet straight away, and perhaps some leaking. And so when we worked together, I didn't have to give her Kegel exercises. I didn't have to give her tons of glute squeezes and bridges and exercises to change her pelvis and her hips and her pelvic floor. A key strategy for Carla was figuring out what was sensitizing her bladder and undergoing specific, sustainable, easy to do in her words, strategies and techniques to disconnect that unhelpful brain-bladder connection. What does that mean? What we implemented were easy to do strategies so that when she did start to feel stress, anxiety, trauma come up into her mind, we had strategies to disconnect those thoughts, those feelings, those emotions from affecting her bladder. And so what we found before we even finished working together, her leaking had completely stopped. And not only that, she used to be peeing every 30 minutes or so. Now she was able to go 4 to 6 hours in between peeing, which was huge for her. Now she could do all of her errands without stopping for a toilet. She was so excited and empowered by this. She said, "This made me feel really free. Now I feel like I can do whatever it is that I want to do." The kicker of all this is we were just about finished working together, and we had something that really was not a nice experience, but it really highlighted to us that we were on the right track. She hadn't had leaking for a while. She was up to that anywhere between 2 to 6 hours in between peeing, and she was feeling super confident. She had a moment where she was outside speaking with a neighbor and heard some unsettling news about activity going around in her neighborhood. And she was rightfully so a little bit nervous. Before she even finished talking with her neighbor, she started to feel that bladder urgency come on. So she didn't think much of it. She's like, "Oh, okay, I think I just need to pee." Went on inside and barely made it to the washroom because she thought she was going to leak. Now, she didn't leak, but it felt like she was going to, and she hadn't experienced this in forever. But of course, Carla thought, well, oh man, as some of my bladder challenges come back, but when we talked together on our coaching call that we do in Leakless Living program, I helped highlight to her, no, this isn't coming back. This is just that unhelpful brain bladder connection that still needs to be strengthened. You need the endurance of that in order to have this fully go away. So we went back to the strategies that she may have been starting to, stop or get off the habit of. We went back to them and made sure that we were going to keep tapping into them so that she didn't start to experience this if another stressful moment came up. But the positive thing was it really ensured to both of us, it reassured us that it wasn't that she had to do, 3 more months of Kegels or do stronger weights and that sort of thing. Are those things going to help her, like more exercises in the gym for full body function? Absolutely. But does she need to do it for her pelvic floor muscle strength? No, that wasn't her challenge. She was actually so excited that this event had happened because it really gave her clarity and a sense of control and confidence that what we were working on was exactly what she needed. I hope hearing this story really helps you, and I'll see you in the next one.